In today's video, I will be participating in Kirliee Cosplay's One Day Make Challenge. For this challenge, I'll be using this 1949 advanced pattern, number 5117. It is a fairly simple design with kimono sleeves, meaning the sleeve portion is incorporated into the front and back pieces. It features a Peter Pan style collar and closes at the center back. The first step was to cut my pattern pieces from this lovely cotton steel swallows print. The square piece of fabric you see me cutting out with the ruler is for my quilt. For you see I have a quilt made up of squares of fabric from each of the pieces of clothing I make. The circle you see is for shoulder pads, which I didn't end up using. Now at this point, I was about to cut out the collar, and I was checking the instructions to see whether I needed to cut 2 of the collar or 4 of the collar. While I was investigating that, I found out the pattern I thought was complete was not in fact complete. It was missing the front-facing bit. Therefore, I went about drafting a front-facing bit, using the measurements of the back-facing as reference. I did, however, find out I was supposed to cut 4 of the collar. I found that fact out by reading step 8, which says to sew the 2 collar pieces together. Now addressing the fact I am using the original 70-plus-year-old pattern pieces here. I am careful with them and use them in such a way as to ensure that they are around for another 70. Also, I enjoy using them for their intended purpose. Now that the pattern pieces were cut, the joy of working with original vintage patterns can begin. For those unfamiliar with pre-1950s patterns, the majority of them were not marked with ink, but instead all important information such as grain lines, darts, tucks, and folds were marked with a series of perforations or holes. This allows the seamstress the ability to mark said important markings without lifting the pattern. This is what you see me doing here with the pencil. Don't worry, the pencil marks are faint enough that they won't be seen from the right side of the fabric. Personally, I prefer unmarked and perforated patterns to the modern-day marked patterns. The next step was to cut out the interfacing for the front-facing piece, back-facing piece, as well as the collar pieces. The type of interfacing I'm using is just a lightweight iron-on interfacing from Joann's. After the interfacing was cut out, it was ironed on and the rest of the pieces ironed in preparation of assembly. The first step in assembly was to attach the back-facing piece to the back piece. This blouse closes at the top of center back. Therefore, before sewing the back opening, I sewed a 1/4 of an inch fabric tube that was then twisted, forming a loop, which will loop onto a button, thus closing and securing the blouse. All seams on this blouse were sewn with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and finished with my serger. After the center back closure was sewn, I focused my attention onto sewing the 10 tucks, which give the blouse shape. There were 4 on the back piece at the waist, 4 on the front piece at the waist, and 2 at the shoulder of the front piece. Those were then sewn and pressed to the center back or center front respectively. After the tucks were sewn, the front and back pieces were attached at the shoulder seam, then sewn. The side seam was not sewn at this time because it is much easier to attach the collar when a garment is flat, which is the next step. The 4 collar pieces were attached as shown, then sewn. The edges were then notched so the collar pieces would be more inclined to turn out smoothly and lie flat. After the collar pieces were clipped, they were turned out and ironed flat. It is difficult to see here, but I am attaching the collar to the front of the blouse. The 2 points of the collar match up at center front, with the wrong sides of the collar being matched to the right side of the blouse. What I just did is pictured, marked by a white arrow. What I'm about to do, join the front and back facings, is marked by a blue arrow. The neck edge was then notched in a similar manner like the collar, and the edges of the facing turned inward to neatly finish the neck edge. I then, off camera, stitched the facing piece to coax it to stay in place and not peek up from beneath the collar. The next step was to pin and then sew the side seams of the blouse. After the side seams were sewn, I marked the hem of the blouse 1 inch away from the bottom, as well as marked the hem of the sleeves by the same amount using tailor's chalk. The fabric was then turned up to meet that line, ironed, then turned up again to finish the raw edges of the hem. I then sewed the hem by machine. Since I would always wear this blouse tucked in, no one would see it. But I finished the hem of the sleeves using whip stitches by hand. The next step was to pin the facings in place, which were secured to the interior of the blouse off camera using tacking stitches to prevent them from moving. Then came the final step of the blouse, sewing a wooden button to center back to securely close the blouse. This one is special to me because it was from my grandmother. And with the addition of a label, this blouse was done. I am very pleased with how this blouse came out. It took, as you saw, about an evening to make. It is simple in design, yet has become one of my favorite pieces in my wardrobe. Here I styled the blouse with a vintage straw and silk flower hat, vintage white cotton gloves, and a me-made khaki circle skirt, which is made from a 1955 simplicity pattern. Hope you enjoyed the process of me making this blouse, and check out the description box for more of me, as well as anything mentioned in this video.